Right now, I want to welcome from National Review Online, Charles Cook. Charles, thank you, sir, for coming back on the program.
Thank you for having me.
You bet. A great piece today talking about against gun registration. And you say that several members of Congress would like to see this become law. Not just, by the way, members of Congress, but we have a lot of state bills out there that are talking about registration and even confiscation. But as you know, we've got these gun control advocates. President Obama himself. I'm not proposing registration. You point out there are a lot of gun control advocates who really are.
Yes, it's probably reasonable to start by saying that Obama hasn't said that in public. Who knows what's in his mind? But we shouldn't ascribe things to him. But he doesn't need to. Dianne Feinstein in that second assault weapons ban bill would have registration of all grandfathered weapons. There's a bill that's been in Congress 2007-2009, was introduced on the first day of the session, which says every single person who owns a gun would need to be federally registered, and everyone who owns a gun would have to register it in the whole country. That would be a federal law. There are a couple of those actually in this Congress. They're not even dead bills. So this is out there.
Well, absolutely, and and again, you point out there's been a lot of ink spilled, tracing the history of the NRA over the past couple of months, but nobody's really done a comparable piece on the history of the gun control movement. But you point out the Brady campaign, then the Handgun Control Incorporated back in 1976, talking about what they wanted to do with gun registration, particularly at that point in time, handgun registration.
Yeah. Just before I answer, I've actually done a piece on the history of the gun control movement. Up until about 1968, it was inextricable from the history of the anti-black movement. So that's the truth that dare not speak its name in American politics on the left, is that the reason given in almost every American gun control bill until the 1970s was that blacks and slaves might get their hands on guns, and it was the Republican Party and the NRA who put a stop to it, but that's not what we're talking about today. No, you're right. I mean, in 1976, you see how the language has changed. What was called Handgun Control Inc. and is now the Campaign Against Gun Violence.
Right.
Who's not against gun violence.
It's not even gun control anymore. Now they want to say it's gun safety.
Gun safety, right? But he said, I mean, the guy said in '76 that the chairman of the Brady campaign, or what would become the Brady campaign, said that this is part of a three-step process. Firstly, we limit the number of guns that are made and go to private citizens. Secondly, we have federal gun registration and licensing, and then we prohibit anyone who is not a police officer or in the military or a security guard from having guns. It wasn't a secret. They're far too clever to say that now, but I do not doubt for one moment that they want it.
Well, absolutely. In fact, the National Institute for Justice had a memo earlier this year. The National Rifle Association obtained a copy of this. The Obama administration has come out and said, look, this is not the position of the administration, work in progress, basically. And of course it's not the position of the administration, because it says things like the semi-auto ban won't be effective at reducing violent crime because these guns aren't used in a lot of violent crime. Maybe if you had a confiscation program, what they call forced buybacks, maybe they say you would see a small drop in the violent crime rate. When it comes to background checks, universal background checks, they say the only way that this would be effective is if it was coupled with a firearms registration program.
Right. I mean, the effectiveness of this is probably the most important thing, in that your listeners are, by and large, going to know the philosophical and constitutional arguments against this. But it's probably more important to say two things, and I wrote these in my piece. Firstly, gun registries, as I'm sure most of your listeners know, don't work. They didn't work in Canada. It was supposed to cost $2 million. It cost $2.7 billion over 10 years. The New Zealand long gun registry was abandoned. The police were begging the parliament in New Zealand to get rid of it because it was so expensive and time-consuming, and it did absolutely nothing. And in the United States, where those gun bans, those gun registries exist in Hawaii and in D.C., nobody can point to any evidence that they actually do anything. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, and this is absurd enough to be hilarious, the Supreme Court has said that on Fifth Amendment grounds, convicted felons who are barred from owning firearms don't have to register their guns because that would be self-incrimination, and they can't be punished for not doing so because that would be punishing them for not incriminating themselves. So once again, we have a policy suggested, these two bills in Congress, for example, that would exempt the very people who are used in order to justify it. It's absurd. It's exactly like the assault weapons ban. They know this full well, but they still want the control.
Well, and that's again. I mean, I think that's why it does boil down to the control, and that's why so many folks, Charles, that I talk to around the country are just fed up. I mean, we're tired of being blamed for the acts of criminals and madmen. We're tired of being told that the answer to stop those folks is to go after our guns and our rights. And again, it doesn't take a rocket scientist or a criminal justice major to look at these proposals and to know that they're not going to be effective in reducing violent crime, but they sure would be effective at restricting our rights, at lessening our liberties, and really at changing our idea of what the right to keep and bear arms really is all about.
Right. In Canada, with the long gun registry, only 4% of all long guns that were used in crimes were registered.
Oh, yeah.
Why do we think that is? Is it perhaps because a criminal is not going to register a long gun with which he's going to shoot somebody? I mean, it's not, as you say, this isn't rocket science.
No, it's not. And I'll tell you what, I mean, we talked with Tony Bernardo, who's the head of the Canadian Institute for Legislative Action, about that Canadian long gun registry for years. And as they were trying to get rid of this, and the gun control groups were trying to mount their last push to keep it in place, the government in Canada had announced sort of an amnesty where there would be a period where nothing would really happen. And so the Canadian Institute for Legislative Action organized a grassroots gun swap and basically had a bunch of transfers of firearms.
Yeah.
Just to screw it up so that the data that was that had already been in the registry was therefore outdated, was worthless, and this was to try to stop Quebec from keeping the gun registry data after the registry had been repealed.
Right.
Because Quebec wanted to keep a hold of it. So they said, well, look, here, there. Now it's worthless data. It doesn't even matter anymore. There are so many ways to go around this, including simple civil disobedience. I mean, Henry Thoreau style, I'm not going to register my gun.
Well, the interesting thing, and perhaps a positive thing for those who are concerned about their liberties in America, is to look at what defense of the Canadian gun registry did to the Liberal Party. It effectively wiped the party out in the west of the country. It saw the left and the right come together in opposition. People and police forces were so fed up with the impositions and the cost of the gun registry that within 6 or 7 years, effectively, of it going into proper operation, it was abolished. Now, if the Canadians are taking that attitude towards a gun registry, I shudder to think what Americans would think of one here. So that is really the silver lining of all of this. It so obviously doesn't work that it's its own worst enemy.
Yeah, there is that, but as you say, at the same time, the Liberals lost credibility in the western part of Canada because they continue to stick with this long gun registry.
Right.
I mean, we still have the push going on right now in Colorado, in California, in Connecticut, and of course, in Congress as well, to try to ram through as many of these gun control bills. How much damage do you think Democrats are doing to themselves?
Well, I hope when it comes to this issue that they're doing a lot, because they're just flat out wrong about it. I think one is right to be vigilant on it, though, because there's not necessarily, and I implied this in my piece, remember Canada still has a handgun registry, so does New Zealand. There's not necessarily an ironclad link between reason and logic and evidence and politics, and it's still good politics in Canada, it's still good politics in New Zealand for them to insist upon a handgun ban that equally does nothing. And, the NRA, conservatives, anyone jealous of their liberty should oppose very strongly a registry on those grounds, because something can be politically popular but not work. I was just pleased to see, though, that in a country like Canada and a country like New Zealand, people did rise up against it.
Absolutely. Hey, listen, Charles, thanks so much for coming back on the program. Great talking to you, and I hope we can do it again soon.
Absolutely.